It's really a pleasure to be here. And I do just want to say that this is a very preliminary talk on my research. I debated whether it was ready to present. I'm still kind of midstream, so I hope you all will take it easy on me. But when I saw that there was this series on empire and capital, it was kind of too good an opportunity to pass up. Because I've been writing a book with a couple of colleagues on this very topic. I am obligated to show you a slide of this. It will be coming out from Haymarket in June. And the talk that I'm going to do today is definitely not a book talk, but some of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting are there in very schematic form in this book, which covers a lot more things. And the big question that animates both this book and my current research project is to think about how China's dramatic rise in global capitalism and increasing inter-imperial conflict with the United States has impacted workers and shaped class politics in China, but also globally. The early ideas for this research project actually started at a conference that Jiaqing and I organized here at Santa Barbara in 2018. Shout out to Santa Barbara Center for Taiwan Studies. And one of the things that I observed there was that during the mid to late 2010s in China, it seemed like China was beginning to lose control of its periphery. So there was massive and violent unrest that was happening in Tibet, in Xinjiang. Both of these were, of course, followed by severe repression, although of different kinds. Then in 2014 in Taiwan, you have the Sunflower Movement, where you have people occupying the legislature in opposition to a trade deal with China. And later that year in 2014, you have the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong, which is demanding full electoral democracy. And so we have this paradox that just as China is increasingly rich and powerful and even challenging the United States for hegemony, at least in East Asia, it seems to be losing control of its own periphery. For the research project, I couldn't possibly do the whole periphery. Xinjiang and Tibet are challenging for all sorts of reasons. And so I'm focusing on the so-called Sinitic periphery, right, which is to say places where people speak Sinophone languages and there's a certain kind of cultural resonance. In the future, I'm going to extend this project to Singapore, but I'm not there yet, so please don't ask me any questions about Singapore. I will say a little bit about why I want to include Singapore down the line. So why is China losing control of its periphery? Well, in the West, at least in kind of mainstream accounts, the typical response is that it is his fault. Xi Jinping, he's a dictator and he wants to crush freedoms of various kinds, and that people in Taiwan and Hong Kong want to defend their freedom. And this is certainly part of the answer. There's no question that it is that increasing repression within China is a major proximate cause of the protests that we see in the surrounding areas. Xi Jinping has certainly centralized power. Things have become more repressive and less tolerant. But it's not as if the Communist Party's threatening behavior towards Democrats is news. Of course, in 1989, there was the Tiananmen Square massacre. In 1995 and 1996, they shot missiles at Taiwan. And so this is not necessarily surprising to people. So I'm not convinced that this repressive turn under Xi, which is very real, could affect such a noticeable social change in these surrounding societies. It seems to me that there's something changing in terms of how people are receiving the PRC's actions or the kinds of trajectory within China that they are imagining that's leading them to a somewhat different and less tolerant response than I think was the case in the not too distant past. To the extent that these protests can be discussed within China, there's two kinds of explanations. The first I'm going to call the brainwashed youth hypothesis, which is basically that young people in Hong Kong and Taiwan have been brainwashed and that they maintain a colonial mindset. This argument suggests that there's something particular about the changes in the educational curriculum or the media that people are consuming, and that's leading them to these anti-China sentiments. But the truth is that this increasing anti-China sentiment in Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is very real, are actually not exceptional at all, but are very much in line with how other rich places are responding. So this is looking at favorability ratings of China in lots of developed countries. And what you can see is in just about every country, China has been getting less and less favorable responses in all of these developed countries. One important exception is Israel. I don't know why that is, but there it is. And the other important exception is Singapore. And I don't have the data here, but Singapore still has overwhelmingly positive assessment of China, and that's precisely why I want to include it in the study to try to understand this variation. I should note that China does much, much better among developing countries, much higher favorability, with the very big and very important exception of India, where China has very, very bad favorability ratings. So again, I don't see anything particularly exceptional that's happening in this period of time. The second explanation I'm calling that you might hear within China, I'm calling the depoliticized materialist hypothesis. And this holds that the people in Hong Kong and Taiwan don't really want democracy. It's just economics, that they're mad about the high cost of housing, right? And protesters, especially in Hong Kong, they really hate this because it ignores their legitimate grievances around police violence and around greater demands for democracy. But there is more than a grain of truth, I think, to this argument, because housing costs in both of these places are out of control. Hong Kong is consistently rated as having the most expensive housing in the world. Taipei and other Taiwanese cities are not as high in real terms, but if you look at the income to housing ratio, Taiwan is actually quite bad. You will probably not be able to read this, but this is income to housing ratio, looking at the medians of both. And you can see the city all the way here on the right, which is much, much worse than any other, is Hong Kong. And then the second one is Taipei. And if you look at the red numbers, those are Taiwanese cities, right? So Taiwanese cities you've never heard of are very, very expensive. And just for reference, I've highlighted here Los Angeles and New York, right? So you can, some of you probably live in Los Angeles, right? Hong Kong is, twice as bad as LA. So that is a real grievance. And in addition to the housing issue, inequality has gotten much worse, right? So here's the income Gini. The red dots are Hong Kong, the blue dots are Taiwan. Taiwan's income inequalities has always been much lower. Hong Kong is terrible, but you can see that income inequality has gone up and it has stayed quite high. The problem, however, is that these worsening material conditions that many young people are experiencing in these places are not despite, but precisely because of deeper integration with China. So my intuition was that China's incorporation into global capitalism is an important part of the story for understanding the social reorganization and then subsequently these political eruptions that we've seen in both Hong Kong and Taiwan, which then leads to the central question that I'm trying to address in this project. How did China's incorporation and subsequent rise within global capitalism impact workers and class politics in Hong Kong? I should say that my intuition about this was informed by Trumpism. I'm American, I live in the United States, we were all here in 2016. I kind of assumed that Hong Kong and Taiwan would be similar, that you'd have this process of deindustrialization with the rise of China that would be generating a nativist backlash against China. You'd have this kind of vengeful and displaced working class. I was quite wrong about this, and I think we'll see why as we move through this. But although there are some similarities, I think, in terms of the social underpinning of all this. I'm not going to say anything about my method. If you want to deal with it in Q&A, I'm happy to do that, but I've done a lot of archival research, interviews, and oral histories as well. Okay, so let's do a bird's eye view of the past 30 years. And I'm going to begin with inevitably the most controversial part, which is a periodization. So I break this period from the 1980s up until the present into 3 different periods. And the first period I'm calling the initial shock, which lasts from 1980s until 2001. It starts a little bit earlier. This shock of China's rise starts earlier in Hong Kong than it does in Taiwan, both because of physical proximity, but also because of administrative issues. Taiwan is still under martial law until 1987. And so it begins, I really date it around 1984 in Hong Kong, once Hong Kong's return from the British to China has been finalized. And I date it from 1989 in Taiwan, and I'll show you some data to explain this in a bit. The second phase I call PRC-centric hegemony, sometimes PRC-centric neoliberal hegemony. This is peak neoliberalism. It is the short aughts, beginning in 2001 when China and then immediately thereafter Taiwan joined the World Trade Organization. And you have economic exchange between Hong Kong and China, as well as Taiwan, and China just explodes. And then the final period is this post-neoliberal fracturing. I don't know why that says 2010. It should say 2009, which I date from 2009, of course, following the global financial crisis in 2008. We begin to see the patterns really change. Now, of course, politics doesn't turn on a dime. And the moment one phase ends, the next begins. But when we look at some of the trends, we can see that people's understandings of themselves, of their political actions, are changing, and that there's some relationship to the structural changes that are happening in the economy as well. Let me give you a little bit of data, and I've tried to reduce the number of line graphs that I have to subject you to, but I think some of them are useful. And in all of the graphs, I've put lines to delineate the different periodization. So here, this is data from the Hong Kong Public Opinion Research Institute, where they ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you identify with these different categories? And they ask them a bunch of different categories. So they ask you, are you a Hong Konger? Are you Chinese? And you can see in the post-97 era, this is just when Hong Kong has returned to China, things are a little bit uneven, right? You have a lot of people who have left Hong Kong and are unsure about what the return to the communist motherland means. But what you can see is that in this period of PRC-centric hegemony, things kind of stabilize, right? And the Chinese identity is holding ground. And in 2008, it even dips, or it kind of goes over Hong Kong identity. I think that this is due to the Olympics. This is when the Beijing Olympics are happening. It gets a little bump. And then very quickly after the economic crisis, you can see this massive divergence. With this data and other data I'm going to show you, you will see that things get a little bit strange after 2020. That's when the national security law is passed in Hong Kong. And this research institute has been visited by the police many times. I don't know what was said, but there's many reasons to question what's happening with the data after 2020. Here's another look at this collected by the same research institute. On the whole, do you trust the Beijing central government? Very trust, quite trust, and it's kind of a weird translation. Very trust is the highest one. Quite trust should probably be like rather trust, and the green is trust, right? So this is some level of trust, and I think it's pretty straightforward. You can see that it's a little up and down in this earlier period. You see a big increase in the level of trust that people have towards the government, and then you can see afterwards it really nosedives, and it really nosedives before the big protests are happening in 2014 to 2019. Taiwan has somewhat different data, and it's not perfectly commensurate, but I'm going to show you a little bit of the data as well. And here they are also asking people in Taiwan about their identity. In this survey, they have a mixed category. So you can be Taiwanese, you can be Taiwanese and Chinese, or you can just be Chinese. The Chinese identity has always been much lower in Taiwan, and it is a generational change. So younger people, regardless of where their parents came from, are less likely to identify just as Chinese. It is now a very, very low percentage. But what you can see is that in this era of PRC-centric hegemony, Chineseness is kind of holding its ground, right? It's not at least losing ground. And in a context where you have this generational change, that suggests that people are open, at least, to this kind of mixed identity. The divergence happens a little bit earlier than it does in Hong Kong, right, with more people identifying as Taiwanese. I actually think that this is also because of the Olympics, right, because Taiwan is markedly not part of the Chinese Olympic team. Hong Kong hosts some events for the Beijing Olympic team, and so they might have kind of the opposite reaction, but in any event, that's what's going on in Taiwan. The data around support for independence is very, very messy, and I'm happy. I actually have some of the data in a later slide. I'm happy to get into it. It's a little bit hard to parse, so I'm going to just spare you another line chart. But the main issue with all of this is that support for independence, or at least another way to phrase it, support for reunification with China has gone down significantly. It remains quite low and is now basically negligible. That's the kind of the short version. So this is what's happening at the level of identity. What about structural changes to the economies of Hong Kong and Taiwan and their relationship to mainland China? I'll begin with Hong Kong. So here you can see Hong Kong's trading partners. Now, Hong Kong is quite literally attached to the Chinese mainland. That doesn't necessarily mean that China has always been an important trade partner, right? Of course, during the Cold War, there was not very much trade at all that was happening between Hong Kong and China. There was some, but you can see that this big increase in trade between mainland China and Hong Kong takes off really in the 1980s. After the WTO, it really accelerates, and it's just a kind of a straight line up, right? So you kind of get the point. One thing to note here is that not only is China Hong Kong's biggest trading partner, it is really the only trading partner that matters, right? All of these other trading partners can, to some extent, be ignored. If you look at Hong Kong investment to mainland China, similar sort of pattern. It's taken off a little bit in the 1980s, but there's a big upswing in this period of Chinese hegemony, but it's also just a straight line up, right? So once again, we can see that as a destination for outbound investment, China is really the only place that matters for Hong Kong. Okay, Taiwan's a little bit different, right? China starts at a lower level and it accelerates later. Now, martial law in Taiwan doesn't end until 1987. The legality of Taiwanese investment in China is amorphous, but we can see after WTO, huge increase. And it continues to go up afterwards, right? So China continues to be Taiwan's biggest trading partner, but the gap between China and the United States, Japan, Singapore, places like that is much, much smaller than it is for Hong Kong. Now, this the big difference between Hong Kong and Taiwan is on this slide. This is looking at Taiwanese investment to China. And here you can see a similar sort of pattern. 2001, investment continues to go up, but then what happens in 2010? It drops, right? And this is a major secular change in patterns of Taiwanese outbound investment. And as of last year, there's more Taiwanese investment going to Southeast Asia than there is going to China. So that is a really kind of major change. There's a lot of things that are happening here, but one of the main reason is that Taiwanese firms' position within global supply chains makes them highly wage sensitive. And if you look at what's going on at wages in China, the dark blue line, this period of time, wages are going up quite a lot, right? And so that pushes a lot of Taiwanese firms to relocate to other places with lower wages in Southeast Asia, now increasingly in India as well. The other thing that I want to note here is that I've put the political parties that were in power during this period of time. So the green refers to the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is the pro-independence party. Probably you know about the KMT. That's the Nationalist Party, represented in blue. And what you can see is that the investment patterns more or less go against what you would expect based on the stated political preference of these parties. So the DPP, which is pro-independence, Chen Shui-bian is elected in 2000, sees a massive increase in the amount of Taiwanese investment going to China. Ma Ying-jeou, who's very, very pro-China, is elected in 2008 and then presides over this huge decrease in Taiwanese investment that's going to China. So you have these structural processes that have kind of been set in motion that's basically indifferent to the wishes of these Taiwanese politicians. Okay, so this is just the big structural backdrop. Now what I'm going to do is provide just a sketch of the evolution of what's happening in terms of processes of class formation and class unmaking, political representation, and then just a little bit about geopolitics in each place, and to think about how these dynamics led to this rapid rise and then fall of PRC-centered hegemony. Begin with Taiwan, from Western advance to militarization, and I'll explain Western advance in just a second. So I begin the Taiwan story in 1989. This is the period. This is the time when factory closures and relocations become very prominent in political discourse. So this is a newspaper, and it's this big headline that says "Factory closure, factory closure." And this is some people from the Shinkong textile company, and they're out there protesting factory closure and the fact that their back wages have been stolen from them. So there's many lurid stories that emerge in the press in this period of time of bosses running away in the middle of the night and stiffing their workers. Most of them are going to China. Lots of them are going to Southeast Asia as well. So it's not just a China story, but it's predominantly a China story. And you hear this discourse of Western advance, or the Xi Jinping, as they call it in Chinese. That is kind of a militaristic kind of connotation to that. But it basically means that capital is relocating from Taiwan west across the Taiwan Strait to mainland China. That's what it refers to. There's a lot of labor resistance to these factory closures right from the beginning. So I already have shown you this photo here. This is a labor magazine from 1991. And you can see on the right-hand side here, this is a poster for a May Day rally. And the slogan that they're organizing around that year is regretfully parting with labor movement warrior Yan Kun-chuen for his glorious imprisonment. So Yan Kun-chuen is a guy who led protests against a factory shoe closure in the city of Kaohsiung in 1989 and was subsequently imprisoned for causing public disruption. This is still, Taiwan's democratization is quite incomplete at this time. And so back in 1991, this is a very prominent part of the discourse. By 1995, these workers who were displaced by factory closures cohere into a real social movement. Lots of different factories workers from lots of different factories are banding together, and they're struggling over compensation. These struggles actually persist all the way until the 2010s, when these photos are from, and you can see people who are being sued for the government for compensation that they believe they deserve. They're throwing eggs at the Ministry of Labor. They're blocking They're blocking the trains in Taipei. In all of these protests and in all of the labor magazines that I read from the time, there was no mention of China. There's no nativism, there's no nationalism in saying China is stealing our jobs in the way that I was expecting, right, based on the experience in the United States, where we were very quick to blame, Mexicans stealing jobs or Chinese people stealing jobs. That was not part of this at all. Okay, what's going on in the sphere of politics? So martial law ends in Taiwan in 1987. You have democratic elections, which begin in 1996. And then in 2000, yeah, okay, thank you. In year 2000, you have this guy, Chen Shui-bian, that I've already mentioned from the pro-independence party, who was elected, and here's how Time magazine referred to it. Chen Shui-bian runs on a pro-labor platform. He comes up in the democratization movement that labor was an important part of. Immediately after he was elected, he recognizes the Taiwan Confederation of Trade Unions, which was the first independent union federation in Taiwan. So labor is pretty excited about him being excited. As soon as he's elected, he governs in the mold of a kind of third way Clintonite neoliberal. Which is a story that we're probably all kind of familiar with. The DPP is fearful of maintaining its power base against the much more powerful and better resourced nationalist party. And so they really reach out to capital to try to shore up their support. So that's brings to a close the period of this initial shock. And then we move into the era of neoliberal hegemony or PRC-centric neoliberal hegemony. And one of the questions that I had in this period of time is, why is it that despite China shooting missiles at Taiwan in 1995 and 1996, which is a story I could get into in Q&A if you guys are interested, and the fact that the pro-independence party is in power, that Taiwan is continually drawn closer to China, at least economically, and I think I would argue socially, and maybe even culturally during this period of time. And the short answer, to be a crude materialist about it, is that there's too much money to be made. Here we have, so in between the red lines is this period of PRC-centric hegemony, and you can see China's growth rates, right, where they're up until the economic crisis, they're averaging well above 10% a year, and Taiwanese companies are very well positioned to benefit from that. The old working class in Taiwan that had been in manufacturing sectors is pretty badly disorganized by now. It had never had much political power, but a lot of those jobs have been lost forever to China and Southeast Asia. Taiwan, in terms of national strategy, is aiming to locate itself at a higher value-added position within global production. The idea is that it can be an R&D center for high-tech componentry, as well as manufacturing some high value-added items. And the best-known examples of this are TSMC, which the semiconductor company, and then Foxconn, which does manufacturing for Apple and other electronics companies. So the idea is that Taiwanese students can get a pretty good return on education, right? You work hard, you go to school, you can get a job with TSMC, and you'll be well paid. And one of the ideas is that these companies' access to the China market will actually improve things for workers in Taiwan, right? So Foxconn can go, they can extract a lot of wealth from exploiting Chinese workers, and they can bring some of that back to Taiwan, and they can do some of the more kind of high-end research-intensive stuff in Taiwan that Taiwanese workers can do, rather than working in these admittedly very dreary manufacturing conditions. The other thing that happens, which is really, really important, is that China opens up its labor market to Taiwanese people. And so you have hundreds of thousands of Taiwanese people who are moving to China. We're taking advantage of this economy that is growing very, very rapidly, occupying a lot of middle management kinds of positions in these companies that are expanding within China. And people see this as a good thing. You can earn more money in China in many cases than you can in Taiwan. You can advance your career, etc. And Taiwan on the whole is getting richer, but it is also, as I've already shown you, becoming more unequal. In terms of what's happening in the sphere of politics, so I've already mentioned Chen Shui-bian, who is pro-independence guy. So he has this quote which really caught my attention. He says, Taiwan doesn't have a so-called right versus left question. It only has the question of unification versus independence. And so my understanding, he's governing again from 2000 to 2008. Basically, once you've assumed this kind of technocratic neoliberal approach to class politics, right? He's saying there's no left and right in Taiwanese politics, right? Then the gravitational pull of China is just too overwhelming. So even being pro-independence doesn't allow him to pull Taiwan further away from the growth miracle that's happening in China. By the end of this period, 2008, Ma Ying-jeou is elected, and he's unabashedly pro-China. This is a quote from him after he left office, but he says unification is actually acceptable to Taiwan, which is not supported by the polling data, but that's his position, and I think is a pretty good indication of where he's at. He's very, very pro-China, and this is kind of, he represents the culmination of this PR-centric hegemony. This is seen as a good thing by many people in Taiwan, in China. The United States is very happy about this as well. I should say that this PRC-centric hegemony even extends to the labor movement. So I mentioned the Taiwan Confederation of Trade Unions, the pro-independence trade union confederation. They're going to China, and they're having meetings with the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is the Communist Party-controlled union, right? So there's a lot of exchange that's happening in this kind of peak neoliberalism era. But of course, it doesn't last. So we move to the period of fracturing, which is catalyzed by the 2008 crisis. You have a gradual slowdown in growth in China, and that has impacts further beyond. If we look at the question of class formation within Taiwan, we see increasing stratification of the labor market. So we have a relatively small number of tech jobs for people. Wages stagnate pretty badly for everyone else. In the years of Chen Shui-bian and Ma Ying-jeou, the minimum wage in Taiwan barely ticks up. So you can see this red line is Taiwan's minimum wage, and it's barely moving over the course of the 2000s. It's gone up a little bit more since, but is still criminally low. The jobs that the labor market, the opening of China's labor market to Taiwanese people is less and less important. Most importantly, because China itself is now producing enough highly educated people to occupy the positions that Taiwanese people had previously occupied in those Taiwanese firms that are in China, but they will do it for lower wages than the Taiwanese people, right? So China does not seem to offer a lot of good jobs, or fewer good jobs, I should say, for Taiwanese people than had been the case before. And for everyone else who's in Taiwan and has no hope of going to China or anywhere else, as in many countries around the world, the kinds of jobs that are available are menial service sector work with no hope of unionization. In terms of politics, so I've already mentioned Ma Ying-jeou. He's elected in 2008, thinking he's ushering in this era of closer cross-strait ties. But his election actually represents the apex of this trajectory, and he presides over the collapse of it. He pushes for something called ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, which is a free trade agreement with China. It's worth emphasizing that at this period of time, the late 2000s, capital is still overwhelmingly pro-China, pro-engagement. They want more trade. They want access to the market. They want access to China's cheap labor supplies. But the social movements are less convinced of this. Organized labor in Taiwan remains very weak for all sorts of reasons, but they don't really have the capacity to resist these free trade deals. But in March 2014, the Sunflower Movement that I've already mentioned took the governing Nationalist Party by surprise. They occupied the Legislative Yuan, and there were massive protests that were out on the street. They were expressing strong opposition to a kind of addition to this free trade deal that would make it easier to invest in services and would give Taiwanese finance better access to the Chinese market. These are basically the downwardly mobile youth, right? These are people who are going to university and they don't see much of a future for themselves in Taiwan or really anywhere else. The factory jobs are not gone. Taiwan actually maintains a pretty high level of manufacturing, but they're degraded and increasingly staffed by guest workers that come from Southeast Asia and these highly exploitative guest worker programs. The growth of Taiwanese corporations in China has not trickled down to these people, and they see not much hope of that happening. But the core of this movement, and this is really important to note, is not expressed as opposition to free trade. It's not expressed as opposition to neoliberalism, and it is definitely not a labor movement. There are some left groups that are in this milieu who try to raise some of these issues to the leadership. They are rebuffed, and they set up something outside of the Legislative Yuan called the Outcast District. And that kind of symbolic exclusion, I think, is quite significant. The core demands are around what they call the black box tactics of the KMT party, which is saying that they're trying to ram through this free trade deal without adequate democratic process. And of course, just under the surface is fear of handing China greater economic leverage over Taiwan. So it's very focused on these kind of procedural democratic questions. That being said, the major political party to emerge out of this movement is called the New Power Party, and they're basically a democratic socialist kind of party, and they have left kinds of positions on the material problems. So I think that there's some acknowledgement that these material problems are there as well. After all of this, it's pretty clear that China doesn't have much in terms of economic leverages if it wants to continue to bring Taiwan closer. The market initially is bringing Taiwan closer, but it fails to integrate it. And now it's pretty clear that if China still wants to integrate Taiwan, that coercion is really the only possibility. Okay, let's move to talking about Hong Kong, which I'm characterizing as from northward migration to national security crackdown. The period of initial shock begins in Hong Kong, again, a little bit earlier in the 1980s, and this northward migration refers to, as you might imagine, the northward migration of capital from Hong Kong up to mainland China, and has the same kind of resonance as that Western advance discourse does in Taiwan. And the industrial working class in Hong Kong just collapses, right? So here's manufacturing employment in Hong Kong. You can see that after the mid-1980s, it goes down and it stays down, which is different from Taiwan, right? Taiwan maintains more manufacturing, especially because of the guest workers. Hong Kong never allows guest workers into the manufacturing sector. So the unmaking of the industrial working class in Hong Kong is more rapid and more total than it is in Taiwan. Politically, in the late 1980s and 1990s, Hong Kong is going through a belated process of democratization under the colonial regime. As in Taiwan, there's no labor or left parties. The pro-democracy party is also quite neoliberal. There are a couple of independent labor people that are elected to the legislature. The key, in contrast to Taiwan, the key axis of differentiation is not independence versus unification, because that question is settled. The key question is around democracy versus being pro-Beijing. And so you have political parties that divide basically on that line. Independent labor doesn't really get on its feet until 1990 with the formation of the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions. It grows to be somewhat more powerful than is the case for organized labor in Taiwan, but still doesn't have a great capacity to impact state policy. So the industrial working class is quite badly battered, but as in Taiwan, you don't see this discourse around blaming China or saying China is the one that is stealing our good factory jobs. And you don't see the kind of nostalgia or social anger that deindustrialization evoked, say, in the United States or in the UK or places like that. Part of this is because these have always been pretty bad jobs, right? So it doesn't have the same cultural resonance that working for Ford or GM might. And also this idea of deeper economic integration with China that is growing very quickly. Even for working class people, the idea that the rising tide might lift all boats seems a little bit more plausible given their recent experience with rapid growth and elimination of poverty in previous decades. Okay, on to the period of PRC-centric neoliberal hegemony, especially in the first few years of this, so just post 2001, you still have the hangover of the Asian financial crisis from 97, 98. SARS comes in 2003. Hong Kong's economy is actually doing quite badly. So many people are happy. And in that context, this deeper economic integration with China raises fears, at least among the labor movement. So I just want to read this one quote. These are from the two labor legislators, and this is the sort of the labor movement's main magazine. This is from 2003. They said Guangdong Hong Kong integration has been progressing for a while, but the thing that working class residents fear most is that mainland China is like a black hole, sucking up Hong Kong's capital talent and employment opportunities. If this kind of integration makes Hong Kong continue to hollow out, the only things left for Hong Kong will be unemployment, poverty, and despair, right? So people are quite anxious, at least the labor movement is quite anxious about what this will mean for them. But in general, in Hong Kong society, people are happy to be able to hitch their star to the economic growth that is happening just across the border in China. What we see is the emergence of global city-style growth dynamics in Hong Kong. There's a growth of a lot of these kind of command center functions, especially finance, law, accounting. And the idea is to enshrine Hong Kong as the command center for the vast hinterland of China. As with all global cities, this leads to a big increase in inequality. I believe New York City is the only city that is more unequal than Hong Kong in the world. And by the mid 2000s, the economy in Hong Kong is much better than it was in the late 90s and early 2000s. The job market is competitive, but there are jobs. And as with Taiwanese people, there's a lot of new job opportunities that are opening up across the border in China that Hong Kong people can benefit from. When we look at what's going on in the realm of politics, the 2000s are the age of mobilization. Big protests that begin to emerge in Hong Kong, and many people interpret this as laying the groundwork for the massive anti-China social eruption that we saw in 2019. I actually see it a little bit differently. So the first big mobilization was in 2003 against an authoritarian anti-subversion law. What I see here, though, is a real sincerity to engage with the state. And actually, the state is pretty responsive. People come out and they say, we don't want this law. The state withdraws it. And in fact, the chief executive who proposed it was forced to step down. So I think that there's no straight line between protesting against a certain policy of the state and wanting to overthrow it or become independent from it altogether. And in this period of time, people are putting demands on the state and getting some sort of a response. The political parties that exist in Hong Kong are all very neoliberal. The only question is about the pace of democratization of the Legislative Council. In 2003, they signed something called the CEPA, the Closer Economic Partnership Agreement, which is a free trade agreement between Hong Kong and mainland China. The Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions and other left civil society groups are opposed to it on the basis of it being free trade and neoliberal, but they don't actually have any capacity to affect the implementation of it. The other thing that's happening with these labor groups is that they are also doing a lot of China work. So all of the NGOs and independent labor activism that happens in mainland China in this period of time is really Hong Kong groups that are doing it, oftentimes with foreign foundations giving the money to the Hong Kong groups to then go do things in mainland China. So there's a way in which these labor groups want to get into the China market as well. And I say that cynically. I was very involved with a lot of these groups. I think that they were doing good stuff, but they have a real stake, I think, in what's happening in China as well. Geopolitically, there's this kind of confluence of interest between China and the United States and other Western powers. China wants capital, and that's the main thing that Hong Kong can provide. And US and British and European financial interests would like to make money. So it works out. The government in this period of time is not really messing with right to assemble, freedom of speech, academic freedom, things of that nature. And so the relationship looks pretty stable, and Hong Kong people in general are much more relaxed about being part of China by the mid-late 2000s than they were in the 1990s, just before the return to China. But then the economic crisis happens in 2008, right? Inequality in Hong Kong has been outrageous all along. It remains high. One of the major things that happens after the 2008 crisis, when Europe and the United States are not doing very well, is that Hong Kong is flooded with capital from a now wealthy China. And Hong Kong's housing market becomes a speculative outlet for Chinese capital, which of course has a huge impact on the quality of life for people who are living there. In terms of jobs, remains highly stratified. One big change is that the government has made it much easier for tourists to come from China to Hong Kong. And so you have this flood of capital and you also have a flood of tourists. So there's a big expansion of employment in service sector and hotels and food and beverage. These are not good jobs, right? They're kind of menial and do not offer decent protections. The other major thing that's happening is Hong Kong's labor market is opening up increasingly to people from mainland China. And so now those people from Hong Kong who are graduating from universities and want to get a job in accounting or finance or what have you, are competing against people from mainland China who got their degrees from Santa Barbara or Cornell or Tsinghua University in China or places like that. They speak English fluently, and they are now labor market competition for the people who are from Hong Kong. Politically, social movements keep mobilizing around various issues. Labor is quite weak, but students really take political leadership in 2014 with the Umbrella Movement, which is in many ways very similar to the Sunflower Movement. They're not talking about class-based issues or material issues. There's a pretty narrow focus on the question of the pace of electoral reform and wanting to directly elect the chief executive in Hong Kong. But as with Sunflower, the main party to emerge out of this movement, which is called Demosisto, it's a little bit less left, I think, than the new power party in Taiwan, but it's at least a social democratic party. And if you look at their platform, they talk about democratizing the economy, making jobs better, doing housing reform, et cetera. I can't say much about the generalized social revolt that happens in 2019. It is very, very dramatic, but it is basically just an intensification of the things that began in 2014. One thing that has changed a lot by the end of the teens is the geopolitics, which is to say, China is not interested in being lectured by the United States and Britain on human rights and what's going on in Hong Kong, and they have the capacity more or less to ignore that. But the policy of trying to integrate Hong Kong society more closely to China with a promise of more growth has also clearly failed by 2019. Capital flooding into Hong Kong, which was proposed to be good for people in Hong Kong, has actually been a disaster for most people. And so the only option left to the Chinese state to integrate this society is a coercive one. And so they resort to massive police violence. They implement this draconian national security law. They liquidate the opposition political parties. They liquidate the independent trade union movement. There's mass imprisonment of protest leaders, especially labor leaders. Okay, just to wrap things up here. So in the era of capitalist transformation, Beijing was hoping that the market would be able to integrate most of the territories of the former Qing Empire, including Taiwan and Hong Kong. My argument is that China's incorporation into global capitalism and its astonishing growth kind of looked like it would be able to accomplish that feat by the mid-2000s. And even the liquidation of much of the old industrial working class in these two places didn't really slow that process, nor did the election of pro-independence parties in Taiwan. This PRC-centric hegemony was looking quite robust by the mid-2000s as it pulled these neighboring societies along kind of in its wake. But it was those very market processes that also undermined the construction of hegemonic rule. So if we think of the China shock, as some people have referred to it, it undermined manufacturing labor. It produced massive market opportunities for Hong Kong and Taiwanese firms, but only a small number of highly compensated positions for Hong Kong and Taiwanese workers, and everyone else is left to this kind of degraded service sector work. As growth in China slows after 2008, the fabulous wealth accumulation had a harder time papering over these social problems that had emerged in these neighboring societies. But in contrast to my idea about the sort of parallels with Trumpism, it was not this nostalgic working class wanting to make Taiwan great again, but a downwardly mobile and highly educated youth that led these rebellions. By the mid-2010s, things were too late for Hong Kong. Its economy was completely sutured to China, and there was really no room for maneuver. But in Taiwan, capital had in fact been diversifying away from China for many years, basically since the economic crisis. And in part because of this, the state still maintains some degree of autonomy. If China wants to incorporate Taiwan now, it's pretty clear that the only option is a military one. I want to talk a little bit about this theme of empire in capital. I think if we're thinking about China as an emergent empire, there's a real challenge in incorporating richer and globally networked places like Taiwan and Hong Kong into this emergent empire. If we think about Xinjiang and Tibet, these are more recognizable colonial projects of dispossession and forced assimilation. Taiwan and Hong Kong are a thornier problem. And I draw on Gramsci here, you might be able to tell. And I think he needs some help thinking through this problem. He's got this one quote that I'm going to read. He says, "An ideology born in a highly developed country is disseminated in a less developed country and has an effect on the local interplay of combinations. But what happens when the location within the world system is reversed? That you have a less developed place that's trying to exercise hegemony over more developed, more central places in global capitalism? Is that possible?" And I think it's very hard. And it's not just because people are bigoted or imagine themselves to be superior to these less developed places, and that does exist for sure. But Gramscian civil society in China is quite poorly developed, right? There's no relative autonomy for intellectuals to be able to articulate some sort of hegemonic vision. And I think quite clearly the PRC has failed to exercise moral and intellectual leadership, as Gramsci would talk about it. But also I think that the growth dynamic just makes it very difficult, especially when the intensity of the effect of growth in this late developing country is so globally significant. You have this problem of of post-industrialization, speculative real estate investment, and downwardly mobile youth. And of course, this is not unique to Hong Kong and Taiwan, but I think that these problems are intensified in these societies given their socio-political proximity to China. And of course, it's intensified further by Beijing's claims of sovereignty on these territories. And so these effects are more dramatic. Okay. I think one final point. Thinking about this in the context of inter-imperial rivalry, which of course has been intensifying between China and the United States. We have intensified inter-imperial competition, but there's no counter-hegemony for people in these societies to latch onto. For Taiwan, tacking back towards the United States or Japan or India, as it is doing now, is a tactical move and may be able to increase its room for maneuver, but it's not going to address the social problems that I've identified here. This is a big contrast, actually, to the post-war, right? So whatever the extreme violence that the United States and its allies caused in the Pacific, if we look at the post-war era, this US-anchored capitalism led to robust growth and a reduction in inequality in Taiwan in the post-war period. So there was a material basis to US hegemony. And one surprising thing that I found in the archive was that even under the Reagan administration, they intervened because the KMT was thinking of passing new restrictions on the right to strike. And the Reagan administration said, you should leave the right to strike untouched, which is, irony noted. But in any event, that was a very different period of time. And if we look at the United States and Taiwan are trying to conclude a trade deal right now, this is under Biden's worker-centered trade policy. It's not going to create the same kind of basis for that kind of US-centric hegemony. So I think without more robust counter-hegemonic articulations, that these places that are really at the forefront of this imperial contestation are going to continue to see internal social disequilibrium, which will only be intensified by the geopolitical situation. Leave it at that. Thank you very much.
I was hoping you could go back to that graph about Taiwanese investment in China and the kind of rise during the GPP and then sort of the fall during KMT. I think it was really interesting, especially what you were saying about maybe representative of shifts in the ideology of the KMT and a general diversification. But I was hoping you could just sort of, generally expand on maybe why this shift happens in this way, or is it kind of post, financial crisis shift away from China long term, or even now with the most recent election, right? The KMT isn't really pitching for reunification in the same way that they were. So is it a shift within the National Party, or but yeah, I was just hoping to talk a little bit more about this because I found it really interesting.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and then Renata DT, and then there's a grad student with a question.
I'm Renata, and I'd like to hear about your methodology. A chart, and then would like to know which other did you use and where you begin with. In which ideology we start to.
To add two more questions. One is about the use of Sinosphere, because you choose Taiwan and Hong Kong as two cases of studies. So I'm wondering how the similarities and differences between these two places can enrich our understanding of the notion of the Sinosphere and even the notion of Sinophone, right? Because Sinosphere is partially derived from the theory of science. And second is at the very beginning of the talk, you mentioned the sharp contrast in terms of identity in Taiwan and Hong Kong. So I'm wondering how it relates or unrelates to the economic process like Western advance in Taiwan or Northern migration in Hong Kong, and also student protests in these two places.
Great, thank you.
And then M has one more for you to pass on this first round.
One more?
From Zoom, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, one of our global MA students is asking if we can, if you can talk more about how you integrated your archival work and oral history with the more quantitative statistics you showed. and how these two kinds of sources, or I guess more than two kinds of sources, informed each other.
Okay, great. Okay, wow, that's a lot to take on. Let me begin with this chart since that's where we started. So the basic thing, which was initially in my talk, but I didn't have time to, so I have a good opportunity now, is that there is no alignment. There's almost a negative alignment or between what the politicians are saying and what capital is doing. So Chen Shui-bian, the president before him is this guy named Li Donghui, right? He was from the KMT, but he's born in Taiwan and is actually seen as being pretty anti-China. His policy then is called it's called biding your time. It's very hard to translate. Biding your time, no haste. I forget what they call it, but it's basically saying don't bother going to China, right? And that is happening. These numbers are actually a little bit artificially low because most of the capital that was going to China in this period of time was illegal or it was being routed through Hong Kong, right? And so while he was saying that, capital was actually really beginning, it was going from zero basically to a pretty significant number by the time he steps down from office in 2000. And as we know, like, you know, Chen Shui-bian is in power and he's pro-independence, right? And so, but this thing is still happening. So that's, I think, the thing that I take away from all of this is that the politics has very little capacity to influence it. We have Ma Ying-jeou, right, who's very pro-China. And, you know, by 2016, Tsai Ing-wen is in power. She's got this thing called the New Southbound Policy, which is rehashing something that Li Donghui had said in the 1990s, which is basically to say more Taiwanese investment should go to Southeast Asia and India now rather than going to China. She says that once capital has already made up its mind to leave, right? So I am making some jokes about being a crude materialist here, but like I really think that capital is kind of doing whatever it wants. And it's not that no states have a capacity. All of this is very political, right? China's decision to allow capital into China is a very, very political decision. But for Taiwan itself, I think that state has little capacity to influence it. The big drop off, you know, I already mentioned, it has to do with Taiwan's position in global production. So a lot of the early investment that went is in very labor intensive, low end manufacturing, garment manufacturing, shoes, toys, et cetera. That stuff is extremely wage sensitive. And when I was doing research in southern China, right after the economic crisis, we already saw a lot of factory closures and people were moving to Vietnam, people were moving to Cambodia. By people, I mean Taiwanese investors, right? And so for them, wages go up just a little bit and they can't really compete. And even Foxconn, right? Well, there's another piece of it, which is that geopolitics do kind of matter. Right now you have Apple telling Foxconn, you must build factories in India, and they're overseeing a huge expansion there. And so at this point, the relocation of Taiwanese investment away from China is kind of overdetermined. I do just want to draw attention, though, to the fact that it looks very different than Taiwan's trading partners, right? The line is still going up. What's going on there? It's basically semiconductors, right? So they still produce the very high-end semiconductors in Taiwan, and then they ship them to China to be put into your iPhones and your computers and whatnot. So the economic relationship is still important, but capital is increasingly going to other places. Okay, I have a couple of, maybe I can integrate the questions about the methodology and archives and how I integrate these different approaches. I'm not a historian. I'm trained as a sociologist. Until it was impossible for me to go to China, I was an ethnographer, and that's the kind of research that I prefer to do. So I had to learn how to do this on the fly, and I didn't get to sit in graduate seminars and learn from people like Nelson and other historians who could who could show me the way. So it was very on the fly, and it was an iterative process, I would say. The oral histories were useful for me just because I'm used to doing interview-based research, and so I can go and I know how to talk to people and to try to understand what they themselves think is the important part of the story. And I got to interview some people who had very long, memories of the labor movement going back to the 1980s, going back to the 60s and 70s even. And so that for me was really important because it was a new topic of study. I didn't even know where any archives would be. I had no idea what I might be looking for. Once I had that kind of general groundwork in place, and they could also alert me to different kinds of sources, right? So they could say, well, the thing that you have to do is you have to read Lao Dongzhou, which is this magazine that's been published since 1984. And you go to this archive and you can get every copy. So one of the things that I really depended on was labor movement's own publications. And I've done a kind of exhaustive reading of, I'm still part of the way in Hong Kong, but in Taiwan, I've done a lot more. There's a labor museum in Kaohsiung, which has really fantastic archives. And it's mostly publications from labor organizations, but I'm also really interested in what capital is saying. So I've gathered a lot of white papers that's put out by the employer associations that talk about why they think more trade with China is good, how they respond to the sort of the security concerns about this means that China can take over Taiwan and things like that. Once you get to the mid 2000s, but especially like the late 2000s, I'm sure this is something that historians talk about, but you're just overwhelmed with digital resources, right? Like you go on Wayback Machine and it's like, wow, I can find absolutely anything. And that has been something of a challenge. And I would appreciate any insight that you all might have about that. In terms of this kind of descriptive statistical data like this is, I also did this at an early stage. I just wanted this kind of like bird's eye view, like what in general is going on in these places? How are people in Hong Kong and Taiwan feeling about themselves? And I have to say the thing that, that I really emphasized here that is not talked a lot about in the literature is that people in both these places were pretty pro-China in the 2000s. Like I think that very recent history has kind of been erased and we skipped straight to the everybody protesting and saying China is evil. And we kind of missed this thing, which, was this fated to fall apart? I don't really know. But that to me was a really important part of the story. And so then when I actually started going to Taiwan, I could talk to people about that. So the piece that I have about labor market opportunities for Taiwanese people in China, this is something that I had known from being in China at the time. But it wasn't until I went to Taiwan and I sort of had these statistical things. And I remember talking to someone who was very pro-independence, like does not like China at all. And he was like, oh yeah, like my brother got a job there at that period of time. And everybody thought it was great. And this was a good career move for him. And so that kind of like ethnographic detail of, okay, if this guy thinks that a family member going to get a job in China at that period of time is a good thing, that suggests that there's something that's happening kind of at the level of culture that's important. Okay, use of Sinosphere. Not well defined. In fact, my wife was interrogating me about this on the drive up, and I was kind of like, you should really think that through. Part of it is just the complexity of the language, right? So if you call it Greater China, people in Hong Kong and Taiwan hate that, right? Because that suggests this is part of China. If you just call it China, which is what the sort of official line in PRC would want it to be, people in the PRC might like it, but other people would not. So there's the kind of the political question. I think in terms of thinking about the relationship to Sinophone studies, one of the things that's been debated is precisely about the relationship of PRC. So one of the things that Sinophone studies is meant to do is to draw attention to all of these Sinophone societies outside of the PRC, right? So to decenter it a little bit. That's not exactly what I'm doing. China is very central, of course, to what I'm doing. But for me, it's more kind of interactions between these places that have cultural similarities. I do think that the question of sovereignty is really, really important, right? And the fact that China claims these places as its own territories changes those political dynamics, I think, quite a lot. That being said, I mean, the starting point from all this is that the sentiments that people in Hong Kong and Taiwan are experiencing in terms of how they think of China is very much in line with how other rich places around the world are thinking about it. So again, this is like, for me, not really theorized. It was more a strategic, like, what do I call these three places? How do I, rather than just saying China, Hong Kong, Taiwan. But I do think it's a way to draw attention to the kind of unique cultural relationship that is mapped onto a very important economic relationship. What was the other question that I had? Oh, you also had the question about the about the identities, changing identities in Hong Kong and Taiwan. So I was telling the story as a bit kind of overly determined, I think, by what's happening in economic processes, and it's not really quite so simple. What happens if you're looking at this, the biggest and most obvious spike that's happening here is in 2015, right? Where the Hong Kong identity shoots up and the Chinese identity drops off a cliff. And if you if I go to the Taiwanese pro-independence data, which I have at the end. You can also see a big, this one. So this is a mess, which is why I didn't show it to you. But the maintain status quo, move toward independence decision, you see a big spike after 2019 in Taiwan as well. And that's because of the police brutality against protesters in Hong Kong, the implementation of the national security law. And so these kind of political effects are having a huge impact on how people think about their own identity. And we go back to Hong Kong, like that's the thing that changes it permanently and irrevocably. So it's not just a story of economic integration, but okay. I think that was the most efficient response I could give to all those questions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Nelson Lichtenstein, historian becoming journalist. Okay, that's what I'm thinking. Okay, so here's what I've been obsessive about recently is the UAW and its effort to organize battery plants and then in conjunction with the Biden administration's effort to construct a electrical and a chip industry in the U.S.
Yeah. So
in listening to you, it seems to me there's a problem here. Not to put Trump aside, but with the Biden UAW. Okay, so if the U.S. is going to subsidize a really big chip industry domestically, this is going to have an impact on Taiwan, which is now right the center of. I mean, their exports are chips to China and to the U.S. Right. This is a huge thing. This is going to be a big problem for Taiwan at the same time as the U.S. is supporting Taiwan. So that's one thing. And then on the battery, on the electrical vehicle thing, I was just reading an article in Business Week that the Chinese, what's that Chinese company? It was like
CATL.
Twice as big as Tesla. I mean, it's growing faster.
Oh, BYD.
Growing faster, undercutting Tesla, et cetera, et cetera. So the question comes from my interest in will the UAW be revived and the American working class, but I see this international cross currents here that may be undercutting this green labor transition here in the U.S. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different strands in it, but briefly on the chips question. This is hugely controversial in Taiwan. It's hugely controversial in Taiwan, right? So in Taiwan, they talk about it as the silicon shield. So this idea that we produce the world's most advanced semiconductors, TMC alone produces more than 90% of the most advanced semiconductors. All of that production is in Taiwan itself. They don't put any of that in their plant in China. The plants that they're building in the United States, Germany, and Japan are not going to have the most advanced technology. And people think about it as national security. China cannot bomb us because China and the rest of the world depend it. Yeah. At the same time, the United States cannot afford to not defend us because if we don't defend Taiwan, then then our car industry is going to go under, as we found out during the pandemic. So they're very anxious about it. So they're going to build the second generation, from like 5 years ago or so. They're going to build that in Arizona. And the geopolitics here are very clear. So they're not allowed to build anymore in China. They're building in the U.S., Japan, Germany, right? So I think the dynamics are pretty obvious. Morris Chang, who's the CEO of TSMC, hates the factory in Arizona. Every time he talks to the media about it, he's complaining about it. He's complaining about the union labor, right? So part of the deal is that you're supposed to at least have these neutrality agreements. You probably know about.
Wait, explain that Morris Chang is who is?
Morris Chang is the CEO of TSMC.
TSMC is the
Taiwan
chip. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Taiwan Semiconductor.
Yeah.
So the building of of the fab, which the federal government is subsidizing massively. The first thing is he's always like, this is a bad business idea. Were it not for the fact that Americans were giving us billions of dollars, we would never do this. The next thing is that they're very mad about all of the union labor that they are supposed to hire. And so they've been trying to bring in foreign workers to do the construction. They're also very upset about the engineering workers. And he's got all these quotes where he says, well, in Taiwan, we can just call people at 3 a.m. and tell them to come into the plant and they'll do it. And the Americans are complaining and they only want to work 9 to 5. And how can you run a fab that way? So, is this good for America? Like, we're giving them billions of dollars and like these are the kinds of jobs that they're supposed to be building. And it's not even the kind of the cutting edge technology. So like the geopolitics of it are all, I think, quite complicated. But it does not make me particularly optimistic about labor, I mean, I think with respect to, if you think about BYD and Tesla, one of the reasons that this inter-imperial conflict is so corrosive is because it creates all these incentives to make your nation's commodities cheaper, right? And so China has a comparative advantage because their workers can't unionize. And so, I know that you have the Bluebird example in Georgia, right, where they have the neutrality agreement and they're unionized. Is the federal government, even under Biden, going to put their finger on the scale when it comes to unionizing Tesla? I'm not optimistic about that, right? And China is like a big Republicans will put it up in Congress and they'll say, BYD is selling this many cars, we got to get behind Elon Musk. So I think it's very destructive for the labor movement. Sure.
I have like 10 questions. I'll save for later. I guess I just want to ask a little bit, if you could help us, tell us a little bit more about your approach as a kind of critical China scholar and what you're doing differently that helps us see China differently. Because I think the amount of work that goes into having a critical take on China is a ton of work. So the first is just that, in a way, the way that you're thinking about these pro-democracy movements from a materialist approach is super interesting because you're not giving us a typical labor story, right? You're saying that a way to read these pro-democracy movements is through a kind of materialist understanding of ongoing restructuring and capital. So one is, if you can just say a little bit more pedagogically about why take that approach and what it does for kind of reading the pro-democracy movement differently. And the second is just if you could just say a little bit about what the work of being a critical China scholar requires, because I think that there's a way that, talking about China critically in the US context is really difficult, especially in your own positionality as a white person, right? Like on the one hand, mainstream China scholars can very quickly kind of advocate for these pro-democracy movements as a way to kind of back up a new Cold War narrative about China surveillance bad, US surveillance good. But on the other hand, I think sometimes critical Chinese scholarship can very quickly veer into this kind of apologism for the Chinese state. And you're doing neither by looking at Hong Kong and Taiwan. So I just wanted to invite you to reflect a little bit more broadly about the project of doing critical China scholarship.
Thank you. A huge topic as well, and that book slide that I mentioned at the beginning. That's the reason we wrote this book. So there's four of us co-authors, one other academic and two activists, and we're precisely trying to think through this question about how to deal with the question of China, how to be critical of China as a major capitalist power without then supporting the major capitalist and imperialist power of the United States. And yeah, your positionality really. I mean, that book, there's two Chinese people and then two white Americans, which gives us different kinds of perspectives. But you do have to be very conscious of that, and I try my best to be very conscious of that. Okay, so first thing, a little bit more kind of on the academic side of things. How to see China differently? A lot of what's been written about this topic, the social rejection of China in Taiwan and Hong Kong, this is real. This is just a kind of an empirical reality. From the American context is as I said at the beginning, we'll say, well, these are people who are striving for democracy, and I think that is true. But it oftentimes focuses on kind of the question of what is the Chinese state doing in these places? What are the nefarious things that the Chinese state is doing with disinformation, with interfering in elections, with police repression, propaganda efforts, United Front, all this kind of stuff? I'm not saying that those things are not happening. I'm also not saying that those things are unimportant. I think that they are important. But what I'm trying to do is to just to have a somewhat different perspective on this, to say, not is it kind of like, what is the Chinese state doing to try to undermine whatever institutions exist in those places, but to try to understand the effect of China and its incorporation into global capitalism on these places. And the reason that I'm doing that is because and this is, I think, hopefully clear in the way that I set it up, I see what's happening in these places as very similar to what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Western Europe. So when I think about the relationship to Trump, I think of them as, and these protests as kind of homologous to what Trump is doing, and you'll have to excuse the biological metaphor, right? But a homology means that you share a kind of common origin, but they're not analogous in the sense that the function that they play in these societies is quite different, right? So the kind of the origin is that China's incorporation into global capitalism is the single most disruptive event since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? So how is that kind of reverberated into all these different societies? And that's the kind of the common origin, but they're not analogous, right? Because what Trumpism is trying to do politically is the reassertion of white nationalism. What these movements are trying to do, I think, is to try to use democracy and liberal democracy, and Americans can be cynical about the long-term prospects of that, right? Especially if it means suturing yourself to American empire, but to try to use greater democratic process to respond to this real social crisis that has been engendered. So, I think that is a somewhat different way of seeing China. I'm not kind of unique, I think, in this approach in certain ways, but that's what I'm trying to do. In terms of thinking about how to be a critical China scholar, kind of more practically speaking, how do we talk about supporting these movements without just apologizing for American empire? I mean, American empire there's nothing, it has no track record of supporting democracy. Donald Trump was in Hong Kong, was talking about the Hong Kong protest as late as the summer of 2019, months after they had started. And he said, my good friend Xi Jinping, I trust him to handle these protests. So it was very transparent for him that this was a question of, this is a bargaining chip that we can use with China. And he obviously has no ethical opposition to massive police violence and authoritarianism. And he said it. And he's more or less said the same thing with Taiwan, right? If China was willing to give Trump the trade deal that he wanted, there would be no question that he would say fine. He said the same thing about Xinjiang, what's happening with repression there. So all you have to do is just look at what the American government has done. They supported a military dictatorship there in Taiwan for decades. It's the longest running martial law in history, right? So you just have to say what have Americans said about this? And I think that being supportive of people who are demanding greater democracy, opposing political police violence is that's a reasonable thing for us. But it is very tricky. And I have to say, of course, I've gotten in lots of fights with people and lost some friends. So, yeah.
Anybody else? On the middle part of your, on the homology part, could you go to your last slide, the conclusions and extensions?
Yeah.
So I was chatting with Nelson briefly about this and about the comparison, and I'd love to hear, I think it was really a provocative phrase that you had in your second hypothesis, which is depoliticized materialist.
Right.
Right. I think it's fascinating because, as you were just highlighting it, it's very political at the same time, but depoliticizing of maybe political economy, but politicizing of institutions and the role of democratic processes, right? But and in the narrative around the sunflower, I remember having talks with Zhong Hong and other people about the identification. Does it become an anti-China thing without problematizing the role of Taiwanese capital, or just what becomes the narrative that people understand as creating the social problems, right, and economic effects.
Yep.
And that in the rise of Trumpism, the politicization of the effects of globalization on the industrial working class in the United States, that's not depoliticizing, but it's depoliticizing in terms of who you're going to target, right? Or it's limiting the way that you see global capital and capital in general, right? That the solution becomes just white nationalist capital or whatever, right? And so I'm wondering, in your view of these processes, how you think about that kind of analytical concept that you developed here, that I don't know if I've heard any, does that come from anyone else, this depoliticized materialist thing? I don't know how I put that, but I'm wondering how you think about that in a global comparative context across neoliberalism's kind of decline, and not just in this competition over the two empires, but but yeah, like how is it that it's so easily skewed, right, in all these different contexts? How is it that the kind of most systematic aspects become mischaracterized so easily? It's like, I mean, the turn of Trumpism towards just like the wackiest kind of conspiracy theories, it's, you know, totally confounding. But like on the other hand, there's so much that's like coherent about it that then you have to wonder how it is that people get turned away from clear political economic view, and you know, activists that are putting in a lot of time into looking at policy and all this kind of stuff. Like it was interesting in sunflower movement, right? Like how narrowly it was targeted to the policy and to the analysis without, right, you know, while marginalizing a broader analysis and program.
Yeah. Should I take other questions? What are we
Yeah,
doing?
sure, yeah.
Okay.
Gather others.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a piggyback, I think, but can you say a little bit more about the use? Like for me, it seems so unfair to call it utility values when they have been, you know.
That was not, just to be clear, it wasn't my account.
Yeah, no,
This was,
I know,
yeah,
that's
okay.
the China hypothesis
All right.
originating in China, but it's, you know, they really put their necks out, right? And so they were really, it was very political movement. And now we're hearing so much about the youth in China who are refusing to work, right? I use a term for it in the
Laying flat.
yeah, the laying flat. And so I was just curious to hear a little bit more about, you know, some of these generational dynamics that you gestured to.
Yeah.
And how, and in a way that is there potential for solidarity across, you know, young people in Hong Kong and Taiwan and China, or across the downwardly mobile folks, which is how, you know, what you described as how I'm understanding this laying flat movement. But yeah, and so yeah. I also find that a lot of what we write about depoliticization from that is very flat, and so exactly what's behind that notion of depoliticizing, calling it depoliticized is the act of depoliticizing what usually are actually very political things.
Sure. Did you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, I just wondered, do you have any data or have you spent any time thinking about different kinds of capital? Because you're talking about capital almost as like a,
Yes.
you know, the government says this and capital goes for the money, but pension funds would be quite different from like small manufacturers, and looking at their motivations and constraints can help you have a more nuanced analysis. I think so. I was wondering if you've done that and not shared it. But...
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'll go in reverse order. So this last question is very important. I have done some of the research, not all of it, but it is very significant. Overwhelmingly, I'm focusing on manufacturing. The reason that I'm overwhelmingly focusing on manufacturing is because this gets at how workers on both sides are impacted, right? Manufacturing leaves one place and it goes to another. It's a little bit different than financial capital moving from one place to another. It has effects, right? But one of the things that I imagine would be really different is because manufacturing is more important in Taiwan than it is in Hong Kong. Very, very important in Hong Kong, aside from the big multinational financial institutions, is real estate. And so one of the ways that they tried to bring Hong Kong closer to mainland China was by giving the development companies in Hong Kong access to the China market, which they did. And they initially succeeded somewhat, and then were quickly just steamrolled by Chinese development companies, right? And so they had in some ways less of a stake than some of the other forms of capital. But the big one, at least with respect to Taiwan, and this is where you begin to see some fracturing, which I think makes it very, very difficult for China to convince them that more free trade is good, or for the KMT for that matter, is around small capital, kind of petty bourgeoisie. One of the major points of mobilization they used on the sunflower movement was this fear that Chinese capital would come and they would kind of steamroll the small business owners, the mom and pop shops. And for some reason, I still don't really know the reason why I keep hearing about this, but people are constantly talking about, well, imagine Chinese capital comes in and they set up haircutting shops. And you always hear I always hear this example of haircutting shops. You've heard this one? And so that created a real fear, I think, on those small business owners as well, which led to kind of, in addition to the students, another segment of the population that was not interested. And Taiwan is famous for having lots of these small businesses. Okay, these two questions on the depoliticization. There's a lot in there. One thing that I definitely wanted to say in response to this. First of all, this was not, I didn't put too much thought into this. Really what I was thinking was, there are people in China who say you are suffering materially, but politics are not an important way for resolving those problems. We just need to give you more money, right? But one of the interesting things to me was that the protesters in Hong Kong did not respond to that. They are suffering materially. Having a more democratic political system is necessary to address their material needs. And they did not articulate that connection really at all in the mainstream of the movement. I'm thinking now more of Hong Kong than of Taiwan, but it's not so different there. Yeah, so that's one piece. In terms of the way they are politicized, which is around this anti-China sentiment. I mean, to put it a little bit kind of provocatively, like the thing that I'm saying, which it might end up sounding kind of condescending, people in Hong Kong have a lot of anger towards China, or the protesters do. And they're saying, look, China ruined Hong Kong. They made my life difficult. And the kind of the response to come out of this research is like, yeah, actually, China did do this, but not for the reasons that you think, right? That it wasn't the secretive manipulations and the plots to undermine Hong Kong that led to this situation. It's actually just more or less these structural effects of China decided to join global capitalism, and then the horse was out of the barn, as it were. The question about young people, which is like, I think at a deep level, one of the things that I'm trying to work through here is, aside from the fact that things are really bad, trying to figure out how they could be better, is to try to think about whether these kinds of solidarities could have been possible, and therefore if they could be possible again in the future. And you have put your finger exactly on it. If you look at the conditions of the young people in Hong Kong and Taiwan who are out there protesting, they are remarkably similar to what it's like to be a young person in Shanghai, in Beijing, just across the border from Hong Kong and Shenzhen. The cost of living is outrageous. What's that?
Santa Barbara.
Santa Barbara, yeah, Santa Barbara. Well, right, this is a global phenomenon. I think it is more intense in East Asia. The cost of housing is higher. People are living with their parents further into their 30s and 40s than other places. The birth rate is lower, right? So all of these things are happening, and just imagining, would it be possible? I think the answer for right now is no, because of the way that it's been politicized, right? And there were people on the left in Hong Kong who were trying to talk about this, like, hey, why don't we go talk to people in Shenzhen and Hong Kong and Guangzhou about these problems? And you say anything about reaching out to people from China, and you're just marginalized from the movement. So, I understand why it happened. I have a lot of sympathy. I supported the movement a lot, but to me that was a big tragedy, and I think ultimately made these movements much weaker as a result.
Thanks. Are there any more time? But
We're time. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Colin.